Good evening, everyone, and very warm welcome to tonight's Writer Speak event at the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard University. My name is Susanna Clark, and I'm the Morton B. Knopfel Professor of Music and the Director of the Mahindra Humanities Center. The series Writers Speak is convened by Claire Messud, who is an award-winning and acclaimed American novelist, and she is the Joseph Y. Bay and Janice Lee Senior Lecturer on Fiction here at Harvard University. She has recently published a new book called Kant's Little Prussian Head and Other Reasons Why I Write, an autobiography in essays. Her book is a series of 26 exquisite vignettes on her life going back to her childhood, and it includes wonderful meditations on what drives her to write. It's a brilliant book. For today's Writer Speak, Claire Messud will both introduce and be in conversation with our featured author, Yi-Young Lee. And now, it is my great pleasure to hand things over to you, Claire. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie, and thank you for that wonderful introduction and those kind words. It's wonderful to be here with everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight for our second Writers Speak event of this semester. Before we start, I'd like to remind you that we will have one final event in the series next month. It will be a particular treat to hear our colleague, the writer and artist Teju Cole, in conversation with the poet Alice Oswald on the topic With Homer. That will take place on Wednesday, December 9th at 4 p.m., and you can register at the Mahindra Humanities Center website. This evening, it is a particular joy and a privilege to welcome everyone to this long-awaited Writers Speak event with Yi-Young Lee, whose visit to campus last spring was canceled on account of the pandemic. Few contemporary writers are as important to us fiction writers as is Yi-Young, which is not to say that her work is not important to the general reader. She is indeed deeply and widely beloved. But the cascade of accolades for Yi-Young's work, from the PEN/Hemingway Award and the Frank O'Connor Short Story Award for her first collection, 1,000 Years of Good Prayers, 15 years ago, to awards from the Whiting Foundation, the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the MacArthur Foundation, the Wyndham Campbell Literature Prize, and the Guggenheim Fellowship Foundation, to name but a few, testifies to the admiration and affection with which she is held by her peers, other writers. This is a matter, needless to say, of the power and haunting beauty of her writing, of the complexity and depth of her characters, the clarity of her vision. It may also be because Yi-Young Lee is a writer whose fiction and essays take many forms, a writer constantly evolving and changing, from the luminous, gem-like early stories to the harrowing novelistic intensity of The Vagrants and Kinder Than Solitude, to the complex but highly articulate elusiveness and allusiveness of her memoir and essays, Dear Friend, From My Life, I Write to You in Your Life, to the wildly different in tone but thematically intertwined two novels of the past 2 years, Where Reasons End, so highly personal and tightly focused, and Must I Go, published just this last August, I believe, which has a sprawling historical canvas. Yi-Young Lee has no truck with fakery. Whether telling the bittersweet story of Granny Lynn in Extra, that always reminds me of Flaubert's Un Coeur Simple, or exploring in her essays the ways in which fiction has been both her salvation and her cross, or inhabiting the voice of Lilia Liska Imbody, the unforgettable, tough-hearted great-grandmother protagonist of Must I Go, Yi-Young observes always with precision and honesty, and yet with an alert recognition of the limits of the sayable. Words are simultaneously everything and inadequate. As Nikolai, the son, says to his mother in Where Reasons End, Yi-Young's intensely moving and intimate 2019 novel written in the wake of her son's suicide. Here is where you are, not where I am. I am in fiction now. To which she replies, then where you are is there, which is also where I live. Yi-Young's work enables us all to live in fiction, to live in words as compelling and inadequate a place as reality, a place that travels alongside and within our everyday if we allow it to. She offers us no easy answers, no tidy reductions of life into comfortable vignettes and happy endings. Yet Yiyun celebrates life in the fullness of its suffering as of its joy, with the intense clarity of her gaze and her commitment to Tolstoyan observation. I'm reminded of the line from King Lear upon the death of Gloucester, when we are told that his heart, twixt two extremes of passion, joy and grief, burst smilingly. I'm going to welcome Yiyun Li now, and I'm excited to start our conversation. I do just want to say that those of you in the audience are welcome to ask questions in using the Q&A box. You're welcome to pose those questions at any time during the course of our conversation. As you should be able to see, there are links in the chat section to purchase Yiyun's books, with thanks to the Harvard Bookstore for their help and support. And please don't hesitate to pose your questions as we go along. Welcome, Yiyun.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Claire?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Thank you for coming and for the chance to talk to you about even a little bit about your wonderful work. I thought, there are so many places that we might begin, but I thought if it's okay with you, we could perhaps begin with the question of the novel as a form, and in particular thinking about these two recent novels, which have lots of thematic connections, but which are so very different formally and in tone and in scope. And I wondered whether they were doing different. I wondered how there came to be two novels in a way.
Yes, that's a good question. I feel like I really like what you said, and any writer should be evolving all the time. I feel that in my earlier novels, if you talk about form, I try to sculpt the novel in the most, complete manner. And now I feel like my novels are a little bit lopsided. So I always, it's not a perfect pumpkin anymore. They're lopsided pumpkins. But there's something about that, I call that lopsidedness, which really is maybe just a change of form of a novel for me. And I think earlier on my novels, I would say probably are more conventional in the way that, development characters. But now I think especially with the last two novels, it's really about what lives I want to contain in those books. And there seems to be a lot of lives going on. And my job is not to create a good structure or, good plot. It is really just to try to catch up with these characters, try to catch up with their lives. So I started Must I Go before Where Reasons End. And in the middle of it, as you mentioned, my son died of suicide. So I stopped working on that novel, and I guess I started to write Where Reasons End. And after that, coming back to Must I Go, it became a different novel. It was even messier. I think the second time I came back, I think it was messier and it was more challenging to write. I think Where Reasons End, in that novel, the mother and son are having this conversation, sometimes, debate, sometimes argument. And going from Where Reasons End to Must I Go, it almost became just my argument with Lilia, the main character. And it was a constant struggle between her and me. In a way, I think, as you said, she's hard-hearted. She had all these, she sort of had all this protection of herself in her narration. And yet there's something about her that I thought, there must be a weak point somewhere. so it's a constant argument with her.
So an argument in the sense that you were sort of almost as it were, touching her outline everywhere to see where she might have an Achilles heel, or an argument in the sense that you were trying to wrestle her into something that she didn't want to do?
I think it's the second. It's
Okay.
actually, I was wrestling because, for one thing, she would refuse to acknowledge life has changed, or her life, or tragedies in her life changed her. She sort of held on to this belief that she could be what she wanted her to be. And it was, I would say, actually, it was a very good experience writing her around the time, because I kept thinking, I am failing, yet she's gaining the ground. She's defeating me. I remember I kept saying around the time, I said, I'm defeated by Lydia. In a way, it's, I cannot, I cannot wrestle her to the ground. And yet I know she feels the pain, she feels the sorrow, she has all this range of feelings. I just want her to tell me, how she feels.
But she doesn't. And I mean, she acknowledges the range of, she acknowledges the pain. I mean, it's perhaps worth saying for those who haven't yet read the novel, which you must do forthwith. But it's a novel about a woman who has had 3 husbands, and has raised a bunch of kids, and has grandkids and a great granddaughter. But her oldest daughter, Lucy, committed suicide, and committed suicide soon after the birth of her daughter. And so she raised that baby, Catherine, at the same time as, just a few years behind her own youngest child, who was Molly, who was 4 at the time. Yeah. So that's a narrative that's at the heart. And she tells us, but only in a sort of almost brusque way, about her, about, she's very cynical and sort of detached, in some way, in the way she articulates her feelings about Lucy, as if she can't really give in to that emotion.
Yes. And
Yeah.
she constantly told, I mean, I think, especially in the earlier drafts, every time she showed a little bit of her feeling, she started to tell a joke, rather frivolous, sometimes flippant. I always worried that she was too flippant. And around the same time, this is a difficult moment, I think, remember that New York City woman who lost 2 children to the babysitters?
Yes. Yeah.
Killing. And I was reading the court proceedings. There was a moment when she said, the mother, when she was in the courthouse, she was so nervous. She giggled all the time. And I thought, well, when I read that news, I thought that giggle was why Lydia was telling the jokes. It was just something about the pain, or the inability to just face that moment, that makes her giggle, or make her tell a joke.
Yes,
So,
that makes that, my daughter, who's now 19, when she was a small child, whenever she got in trouble, she would laugh. And I remember saying to her at one point, I just have to tell you, it's very disconcerting. And when you go out in the world and a teacher gets cross with you, if you laugh at the teacher, that's not going to be, even if your impulse is to laugh, you have to try really hard to keep a serious face, because they don't like it. People don't like it if you don't have the conventional response. People don't know what to do.
right. And yet, that response is so, it's out of intuition.
Yes.
It's, yeah, I think I had that problem too, for at least for a while, after people told me I shouldn't be laughing when something bad happened, and I stopped laughing.
Well, but it's very interesting, because Lilia is it. So I didn't mention to the audience who haven't, that Lucy's father Lucy has a different father, from the Gilbert is Lilia's first husband, and husband for a long time, and the father of her children, and yet Lucy is the product of a brief affair with a man named Roland, who Lilia finds extremely glamorous and interesting, and a lot of the book is devoted to Roland, and who is indeed an interesting and complex character in that relationship. You know, there's lots to say about that, but much more attention is given to Roland than to Lucy, and which is an interesting. I felt as though literally the light of Lucy, which is a name that means light, right? That it was too bright. She couldn't actually look
Right.
closely or look for very long. It was like looking at the sun.
Right.
So she looked at the child's father and spent devoted a great deal of attention to someone who wasn't
There.
actually there.
Yes. And
Yeah.
I think there's probably a reason for that. You know, I was thinking today, I mean, I don't know why I was thinking this. I was just asking myself, what's the difference between past and yesterday? And in a way, I think in that novel, Roland, the father of Lucy, he was already past. He was, you know, he was in the past. But Lucy never became a past. Lucy was yesterday. Lucy was today. Lucy was tomorrow. So I think, you know, we can we can say the past is the past. We can never say yesterday is the past because we're still living that yesterday. So I think that's why she's not looking at Lucy
Right.
too bright.
I'm wondering whether would it make sense you had were perhaps thinking there are a couple of passages, one from each of the two novels that you might read. Is this a moment that it might make sense?
I think so. You know, just to give a sense of Lilia's voice, for instance. So I'm going to read the excerpt from Masako first. So what happens here is Lilia, as we talk about, she was reading Roland, the long lost lover. She was reading Roland's diary, and she started to annotate the diary. And so in the annotation during this period, she talked a little bit about herself. So this is towards the end of the book, and it's a short excerpt. Closure. I wonder if my great-grandmother Lucille ever thought about that. What's the point of closure when at any moment you could tumble off your mule into the valley and never see another day again? Or your best pal could hack you to death at night so he could run away with your $200 worth of gold. Rattlesnakes and grizzly bears and floods and snowstorms. Would they be so kind to wait until you find closure? And the man whom great-grandmother Lucille took care of, both of his legs amputated, just lying there, waiting for his death, what use would he have had for that comforting word? There was this young Miwok mother, 14, really still a girl, when her white husband was crushed by a fallen tree and her tribe refused to take her and her baby back. Great-grandmother Lucille made a place for them in her household. When the baby died, the young mother returned to her tribe. Did she think about closure then? Did great-grandmother Lucille, who was said to have treated the girl as her own daughter, the baby her grandchild? Gilbert was right. I am as hard as the hardest life. My love is as hard as I am. I came from a settler family. Like a settler, I have lived through the bumps and wounds and amputations and deaths. I don't mope. Give me an axe and a hoe, and I'll start a garden. Give me a good man, and I'll build a family with him. Anything I can do, I do it with all my might. But I don't fight storms and floods and earthquakes. I don't deceive myself into thinking I can be who I am not. So that's Lilia talking about closure, and that's a moment that she really reveals a little bit of herself when she said she's as hard as life. And so this is a short excerpt from Where Reasons End. There's a moment when the mother and the son talk about this. Really, they were talking across the border of life and death. They're talking about time. So you can't do that, Nikolai said. Everything looks different if you look at it from after time. Most things, I correct him automatically. If you insist on being so annoyingly precise, he said. Is after time a word? I asked. I think so, he said. If there's noon and there's afternoon, word and after word, I said. Math and aftermath, he said. Life and afterlife, I said. None of them sound as appealing as after time, don't you think? He said. But are you sure you're using it correctly? I said. Oh, what does it matter, Mommy? Any moment that comes after time is after time. Are we in after time then? I asked. I am, but not you, he said. Why not me? You have said you live in days, so you're still in time. You can't live in after time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was beautiful. I have so many questions related to it. Just one a little aside was, did you have Larkin in your mind? Where do we live but days? The but you chose, you said in your note to me that these two passages are for you essentially continuous.
Mhm. Yes.
And I wondered if you might talk a little bit about how Lilia's hard-hearted revelation of herself and Nikolai and his mother's sort of more metaphysical discussion of time. And you know, that passage, of course, reminds me of the moment, which I think is not far away in the book, when he says, I didn't unfriend and cancel life. I unfriended and canceled time.
Yes.
And so I wondered if you could explain a little the connection between this Lilia's perspective and the conversation in where we.
Yes. Yes. You know, it is actually Larkin's poem is in the book at one moment. The mother said, you know, where do I live now? I live in these days, day after day. And I always remember that poem. It seems just, I think there was a moment I would memorize the poem. I would recite to myself just to get the sense that we live in the days. There's nowhere else to live in. And yes, you know, it's hard not to say Lilia, you know, or Must I Go is a novel intertwined with Where Reasons End. I think there's just the coincidence, you know, the two mothers shared something in their biography. But I was thinking, even when I was writing Must I Go, and I thought, this is a woman who lived into, and at this moment, Lilia in the book is 81. She has lived another 35, 40 years that I have not. And she knows something about time that I do not know. And part of, I think, just writing that novel was just trying to see if Lydia knew something that I could learn from her. And it is the time, it is, she had a time that I haven't had. And yet, you know, in Where Reasons End, I had that moment in time, you know, the mother and son could have a conversation about after time, yet the mother realizes she lives in the days. She has no shortcut. You know, we talk about teleporting. Never you can teleport in life. You can always, no, you always have to stay in the days. So I think the continuity or in the exploration was really just to see how time changes a person.
Mhm.
With the same biography, decades, you know, would make things different.
Right. That to be 35 years or whatever further down the road makes things different. But when you say we live in days, which obviously we do, it's also true though, and it's a, you know, it's a thing that I think it come, you know, that exchange I that I cited in my introduction, where Nikolai says, I live in fiction now.
Mhm.
And And his mother says, that's where I live too.
Mm.
And I guess I'm that, there are lots of ways to talk about that. One certainly would be that Roland, who has created with his diaries a sort of fiction, because at the beginning he says, I never lie in my diaries. And then later on he says, I do lie in my diaries. And then of course, Lilia is taking only portions of the diaries, or sharing with us only portions of the diaries, and annotating them. So she's making a story, a fiction upon a fiction.
Yes.
Right. So, and that's something that she seems to suggest has run alongside her life, that she's allowed this. Maybe there was a long hiatus of raising her kids when she wasn't thinking so much about Roland, but at this stage, Roland is occupying quite, she's living in a fictional life, even as she's living in the days with Nancy, the, irritating,
Yes.
irritating woman on the, down the hall sort of thing. So what is the land of fiction? What is the world of words, and what can it do?
Oh, I wish I could ask you that question. What would you say? I think, well, I think there are different ways to approach that question. One is, you probably know this too. As a fiction writer, we live simultaneously in this life and then with a group of characters somewhere there. Nobody can see them. Only we can see them, and we have daily communications and engagement with them, argument, fighting, and I am aware that, having written all these novels and story collections, it is a way to live simultaneously in my life and yet with some characters. But I try to be careful. I don't want to glorify that world of fiction. I want to root myself in this world and just always just to stay aware that fiction world is there. But I think you said something else that is interesting to me, is the world of words, the world made of words. And that to me is as real as this world I live in. I feel like there are people who process things by images, and they probably live by image, or they see things. I'm not an imagery person, so I don't see things, but I do live by words. So it's becoming a habit. It's just a mental habit. If anytime I have a question for myself, I think having a question, or even being able to ask a question, or even being able to find some answers to that question is not enough. It's just to put pressures on the words to get as closer as I can to something. I don't know what that something is, but that's just my joy. I feel that I just love words in that way. The word made of words. I think Hamlet would say words, words, words. Yes, but that's exactly how I live.
And is that something, I mean, this is something you talked about already some years ago, that you always wrote fiction in English, that you from very early thought of fiction as of English rather, as your private language. And I'm wondering if, when you talk about that relation to the world of words, is that specifically for you an English world? And if so, then what is the world of your mother tongue? What is the world of Chinese for you?
Yes. When I say, the words, the word of words, that is actually, I am referring to the world made of English words. And I think partly is I pick up English and I made it my private language or primary writing language. And I think there's a reason for that. I always say, I've been thinking about this, oftentimes in life we are guided by something, and I was just thinking, what guides me? What guides me is my limitations. And one of my biggest limitation is my relationship with English language. I did not grow up with English. I did not have that.
Your readers wouldn't know it though.
Oh, thank you. Like for myself, I do not have that intimacy with the language. That seems to me, it's a limitation. And yet I think that's probably it's for that reason, or that limitation guides me in writing, is to get the words as precisely as I can, always acknowledging that I will not get it right as I want. So that's the joy of writing to me, is just to find words that can say something, but not fully saying it, but say part of it. So
what's, because it's something I feel in all of your work that I read, and I haven't read everything, but I've read quite a bit, and in all the different forms, I feel that the space, and I was trying to articulate that again in the introduction, the space that you accord to mystery, right, and to the unsayable,
mhm.
is very particular. I mean, I think we live in a time that is quite utilitarian and is always seeking, a sort of one-to-one correspondence. You were speaking earlier today in a workshop with students about how a detail in fiction is not strong if it doesn't have a sort of aura of mystery almost around it, that it has to, I think Roland Barthes, might talk about it in terms of surplus, there has to be a sort of surplus of meaning around it. But I'm just curious how it is a sort of Beckettian fail again, fail better. This sort of holding the paradox of language is what we have, language is inadequate, holding in your hand at the same time. But your face as you're speaking of encountering that paradox lights up and is joyful. And I'm curious, I guess, about what that experience is for you, whether it is joyful, whether it's also awful sometimes, what do you feel enough can be said? You must, because you haven't stopped writing.
That's his, yeah. Oh yes, that's right. Something can be said, and I can do it as I feel like it's just, it's one of those, I think, like I cannot remember his name, that Greek mathematician saying you can get closer and closer, but you can never get the point.
Zeno's
yeah. Yes. And I mean, he has his point, but to me, I think there's always something elusive, or evasive, the mystery, or something not quite, I don't feel I get it. But the process of trying to chase that, we're not even chasing, just getting it, it's actually quite joyful. I never despair when I do that. And I think that's probably one reason I love writing so much, is just that joy. I didn't answer you earlier about what my relationship is with Chinese, my mother tongue. I still count in Chinese. I do my math in Chinese. Those are the things you really actually develop with your mother tongue. But I don't articulate anything in Chinese to myself. I think that's a decision once you made. You don't do that. And then you move that language sort of out of the way a little. You don't use that to think. So I don't think in Chinese actively. There's a moment.
Do you and your husband speak Chinese to one another?
We do. My husband is Chinese too. There are moments he would get really frustrated. He said, "Speak English. You're not making sense in Chinese." So I know this is like a trophy, a trophy. I think I'm not using a muscle. I'm not quite articulating what I want to articulate. But if I switch to English, I could make him see my point. That kind of. But I think language is interesting. A few years ago, I was in Shanghai, I mean, I was just so jet lagged, and I looked out of the hotel room and I saw all these trucks with Chinese words on it. I got so disoriented, I forgot where I was. And I couldn't figure out why there was all these Chinese words. And I realized it took a moment for the brain to sort of to switch back to that. And then everything was fine in Chinese.
Wow. Wow. I mean, that it's such an, I think that that question of a, there are many people who live much of life in translation, who sort of, who migrate from one country to another, and in so doing, change languages, but very few become writers in the new language. I mean, you are part of an august and fairly small group of writers, Joseph Conrad, of course, and Nabokov and Hajin, and and you and some others, but it's a pretty small cohort, um and it it is that question of where you then land. Forgive me, because I only just saw it today. You have a piece that's about to come out in the New Yorker, or that is out online in the New Yorker, and will be, I think, in the next
Yes.
print edition, which is a personal essay, a memoir piece in which you write about your father.
Mhm.
And um and I was struck by the things that you didn't talk about with your father, right? Some very, you didn't speak to him of the loss of your son.
Mhm.
And it made me wonder, it made me think again about the role of language and the English language versus, what's possible, right? This
Right.
question of what's possible in English versus what was possible in the language of your birth family.
Mhm. Yes.
And is that something that, do you feel that there are things that you can't say in Chinese?
Yeah, yes, yes. I don't think I've ever said I love you in Chinese to anyone.
Wow. Okay.
It's not in my vocabulary. When my children were younger, I always say I love you, I love you. You know, it's such an easy way to say I love you in English, never in Chinese. There is something about unsayable. I think you said that word unsayable. I think there are certain things in life that are just unsayable, but they are more unsayable in the mother tongue. At least that's my experience. It's even harder. So there was this old tale from the Buddhist Zen tradition. So a little fish asked a big fish and said, "What is Zen?" I think the big fish said, "Well, Zen is just like seawater. The sea is outside us. The sea is also inside us." And I read that when I was 11 or 12. I didn't understand it. Something is outside you, but it's also inside you. And Buddhism called it Zen. But I do have a feeling, I think that language is a little bit like that. I think mother tongue, first language, it's really like sea water. It's outside around me, but it's also inside me. And somehow it's harder to navigate in that way. I think English, I would not say it's outside me, it's inside me. I can tell the border somewhere, and I can cross the border. I can find the words for things that are hard to say. But that seems not there for me, at least in Chinese.
That's so interesting. You also have spoken about not, um, so there was an interview you gave several years ago when you published your memoir, Dear Friend, and it was with the Guardian, and you spoke about how in Chinese one doesn't often use I, the singular I, and that you had very, for a long time, really uh, actively thought of yourself as not an autobiographical writer.
Yes.
But then you said in the interview, but maybe that's a lie. Maybe in fact, I was always in some measure. I mean, one can only ever be in some measure that. But I wondered whether that was something that, as part of your, I mean, there's no question that part of your evolution as a writer over the last decade, with the memoir and then Where Reasons End, these are books that are that one is is memoir, and the other, the sort of proximity to your experience is visible. Um, but then Must I Go is and isn't. Must I Go is something completely different. And is this, as I said, sprawling historical novel that travels the globe and the century, you know, and has many characters, and you can maybe be found in lots of them in some degree, and, you know, but it- but it's it. So I guess I'm just curious about the I for
Yeah,
you at this point.
that's a great question. And you know, when I was younger, meaning when I first started, I'd never written in first person, and it is the discomfort with that I just I also now I understand the discomfort is not only with the pronoun I, it's also just the narrative about myself. I used to think, you know, the whole reason of writing fiction is to put spotlights on other people so nobody can see me. You know, where I functioned under that really the false belief that I could be invisible if I write about other people. And I think that's one good thing about, you know, writing book after book, and things change and life changes me, and I change too. And I think coming back to where reasons, I mean, even Dear Friends and Where Reasons, and just to tackle that fear of using the I think that's what you said, that's the change in me. and and I feel that at this moment that I is not going anywhere. The I is that I is here. I'm not going to be. I don't think I'm so interested in the narrative about myself, but I'm interested in that I now. Probably I wouldn't say interested. Maybe just less fearful of that word
Mm-hmm.
than before.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I was going to ask. So it doesn't feel frightening. It feels inevitable.
Yes, that's exact. That's such a good way to put it. It is inevitable.
Right.
Yeah.
So interesting. There are so many things I want, you know, I have 9 pages of notes, but I'm not, but we have a lot of people who have questions for you. So I think maybe this is a good time to open it to the audience. And those of you who haven't yet posed questions, please feel free, and we will get to as many as we can. So this first question says, thank you for this wonderful event. I enjoy both Where Reasons End and From My Life, I Write to You in Your Life. My question is simple. What is your writing ritual? What works for you and what does not work?
Ah, yes, I guess I used to have a more ritual than I do now. I in my earlier days, I really insist writing every day. You know, writing in the morning, get up in the morning, or write in the. When my children were younger, I would write in the middle of the night, and I think those rituals change. You know, as we grow, as we age, and I don't write in the middle of the night. Something I learned lately, I think it started with Must I Go. You know, we didn't talk about Roland too much because Roland in the book is entirely in the diary form. It was Roland's diary. And when I first started that novel, I didn't know where, I had a vague sense of what it was about, but I didn't get Roland's voice. So I thought, I will just keep a diary for Roland for 100 days. I don't think I did 100 days. I did quite a long time, just writing in his voice, writing about what he saw every day or what he did. And there's some sort of freedom of not committing to the computer file, say novel. It's just writing. So I think the ritual now is I realize it is really good to go back to the notebook and pen, just write words down without censoring myself. They may not make sense, but once in a while something pops up. So that's my ritual now. I try to write in the notebook every day.
So that's really interesting. So when you were writing Roland's diary entries, the 100 days, they weren't sort of dated the way they are in the book and cover, you know, this is 1939 or this is 1950. No, it was
was entirely more mundane than that. Even it was just very commonplace, complaint about
Mhm.
life.
Inhabiting, living in his skin. It was
Yes,
just was living in
yes,
his.
yes.
So great. That's so cool. Thank you. Okay. So the next question. I appreciated your admission that a writer is always evolving and changing, arguably both in how they observe the world and in how and what they write. Do you identify any constants that have remained in your own work over the years in terms of style or how you explore character interiority and development?
That's a great question. Yes, I think I wonder if one's approach to writing changes, but one's obsession and curiosity don't change that much. At least I think the constant in my fiction is all my characters are stubborn, willful, sometimes frustratingly so. And in my earlier work, especially, but now still, I think many of my characters, people would call my characters passive or sad or bleak. And I don't see them that way. I feel that they're the characters who may not be participating in this moment or in life the way others do. But I think, even just the insistence to be themselves is a kind of rebel against something, especially if my characters are in China. Oftentimes they choose solitude, and that choice, that not giving away their solitude, not giving away their loneliness is an independent gesture. So I feel that probably is a constant throughout
Mhm.
these years of writing.
It's that makes me think it because it comes up at in different moments of the Marianne Moore poem
Yes,
Silence, and which is about reticence uh and it seems to me that that's actually almost a tenet or has been a tenet of your life.
yes. I mean, the first time I read Marianne Moore's poem, I was certain that I had written the same words at some point, but I did not write those words. So maybe I just was believing in those words, that approach to life.
Right. It felt so at home to you as a way
Yeah.
of existing. And it's interesting because many of your characters, as you say, but then but not Lilia.
Lilia.
Not Lilia.
She surprised me. She also took over. I mean, she does a lot of things in that novel that I don't usually do. For instance, she uses metaphors all the time. And she always says,
Forget them.
I never use metaphor in my fiction, but she has her willfulness. She has her own sort of like the power of her storm. She wants to talk, and I almost have to just let her. And I think I learned things from her that I haven't learned from my other characters.
That's so, I mean, that's another, I mean, what you were saying earlier about the 35 years that she has of extra time and that I mean, it's a very cool thing to learn from your characters. I'm realizing that I need to keep asking you questions because there are so many. Okay, so here's the next one. I have treasured your fierceness in The Vagrants and some of your New Yorker published short stories. Have you moved from that strong way of understanding what is lost in hardship and how people are so terribly warped by circumstances? I have not read these two novels. Maybe there is a connection. I think these two novels, meaning Where Reasons End.
Yeah. No, I don't think I have moved away from that. I like that word fierceness. I like to imagine that's how I would like to approach life and writing. Or what you said, honesty. Just, always questioning, always ask if that's the real answer or if that's just a shortcut. It's just cliche. So yeah, I hope I haven't moved away from The Vagrants in the way, the spirit of the writing is the same, I think.
I would say as a reader that the spirit of the writing is the same, and that is the constant. I think that rigor, right? That rigorousness is, call it ferocity or fierceness, call it. There are lots of words that we can have for it, but And you know, that's I think regardless of the characters and the situation, that's who you are as a writer. So
Yes.
yeah, I would say it's not my, I mean, the question wasn't posed to me, but
But
that's what
I agree with you, Claire.
so the next question, do you find publishers to be more open to writers of color now in comparison to when you first started?
That is a question I probably don't feel so like qualified to answer. I think that takes a bigger view. I think you have to look at the industry, the entire publishing world. I don't think I'm in that position. And I mean, the only thing I could say is I never really, when I first started, I didn't really think of myself as a person of color or Chinese immigrant, or I feel like the moment you write, these things sort of fall away a little. So I don't think, I mean, certainly I think in the real world, these things matter. So I don't know, that's a good question. I would imagine the publishing is more open now to, and the one thing is good is, you know, when I first started, if any Chinese American or Chinese writer writing, you have to be compared to Amy Tan. And that is, that is gone. That is a good thing. You know, I have nothing against Amy Tan. It's just like everybody has to compare you to Amy Tan. I think now I think there are all sorts of writers. You know, you don't have to be compared to Amy Tan.
Right. The diversity of voices is there's a much greater diversity of voices in the literary culture, but it is certainly true that when you know, I have not, you get asked questions about, you know, the publishing world or the situation, the culture. And I think, you know, it's like you're a little fish in the sea and you have your little path, and you have an editor who you work with, and you have, you know, an agent who hopefully you love, and, you know, and that's sort of all you know after a while. Right. You don't, you aren't, I think it's very different, you know, at the beginning when you're starting out and you're conceiving of the marketplace in a way is very different from being in the moment that, you know, that we both are, which is we work, you know, we have the good fortune to work with people that that and then some of those broader questions we don't keep up.
Yeah. It's a hard, it's
so the next question. Oh goodness, there are 17 questions. I don't know if we're going to get everybody. I'm going to try. So to Yuyun's fascinating account of her relationship to English and Chinese, your phrasing suggests that for you, precision, trying to get the words as precisely as possible, mediates English's privateness and its lack of intimacy. Could you elaborate on this trifecta of precision, intimacy, and the private? And what would its counterpart be for the mother tongue?
Oh my.
You have 5 minutes or
5
less.
minutes. Oh, I think I'm just going to quickly look at the
Can you see it if you?
I don't know. Oh, maybe I don't see.
I think,
but it's okay. It's okay. I think I'm just going to try. I probably will fail this question because it is really difficult. Yes, I think precision is
trifecta. The trifecta of precision, intimacy, and the private in relation to English, and what would its counterpart be for the mother tongue?
In the relationship, precision. Well, I mean, I'm just going to blunder through this question because I already know I cannot answer it well. But you know, precision, for instance, in Chinese is it's a different kind of language. It's quite expressive and descriptive, but there's precision-wise, I think that the beauty of Chinese language is the imprecision. And it's really beautiful in that way, but it's just not my way of writing or my way of functioning, or maybe it's not my, I don't know, maybe it's not my goal to be imprecise. So I'm not answering that question.
Well, I think you are. I think if you have any additional thoughts about intimacy in the private, with regard to either English or Mandarin.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I do have a complex relationship with Mandarin Chinese. One is I did not feel I grew up in a private language, because the language, for instance, my mother used, it's very much the same language the newspaper used, the party used. So it's like a bleeding of the propaganda into everyday language. And so I didn't feel that was my private language. And another thing I learned actually I was a good writer when I was in school, writing in Chinese. I was so good, but I was really good at writing propaganda. That was something when you were 17 or when you were 18, you did not want to know you could write beautiful propaganda to make people cry. And that is I think that's why I moved away from Chinese, because I knew I had that ability to write beautiful propaganda, especially when I was in army. I mostly just wrote propaganda, so I did not have to feed the pigs or clean the pigsties. Yeah.
But that's that's very interesting. We could talk about that for another half hour. But here's a question. I'm curious about your transition from science to writing, and does that experience inform your work?
Yes, I loved being a scientist. I love science, and I think one thing I learned, two things I probably have brought from science to writing. One is I don't think scientists wait for inspiration. Scientists work. They go to the lab, they do the bench work. So that's my sort of work ethics. I have the work ethics of scientists. You have to sit down and write, and put your words down. They're not perfect words, and try to make them better. Then the other thing is, in science, we always just have a hypothesis, and we do a bunch of essays, we do a bunch of experiments, but we can never say, we're at the end of this research, we know everything. We don't have to know anything more about T cells. Or it's always an ongoing. You never reach the end. And I think I really believe that writing fiction is the same. You never really know your characters like the T cells. You just have to get as much as you can.
Right. You can always go further.
Yes.
And so how do you know when to stop?
That's a great question. Well, I still don't. I don't think I know when to stop. I mostly. I don't know. Actually, that probably comes with experience. And sometimes I just have to say it's the end of this character. I'm not going to. I mean, I can spend another 500 pages just with Lilia. And actually, the first draft was probably 200 more pages than that. But you have to respect the characters. They want their own lives and they want their own privacies. You can't spend years with them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So have you felt yourself to be more American the longer you've lived in America? And if so, how has that affected the kinds of stories you find yourself wanting to tell?
I think, depending on how we define American, and I've lived here since 1996. So a major part of my adult life has been lived in America. So certainly, my everyday concern and a lot of things I take for granted, they're American concepts. They're not Chinese concepts. So in that sense, I think I am probably becoming a little bit more American. How does it change my storytelling? I think I can't really say what changes, but I think we writers, Clara, I don't know if you feel that, we live and we also learn from what we live. We learn from our lives and we use those things in our writing. So yes, I think my American experience probably has taught me a lot, and I have I've become more interested maybe in American life in my writing too, American characters.
Well, certainly, I mean, this novel is different in that respect, right?
Very much so.
They have generations of American and Canadian-ness.
Canadian, yes. And I don't know. I think part of me is just interested in the history of the country, in history of the continent. When you live in the place for a long time, you want to know every single thing about the past. I think it's just wanting to know the country's past.
I do. I know there are all these other questions, but I just have to throw in. So you were asked to do a Q&A. I can't let the evening go without. You were asked to do a sort of Q&A for LitHub at this fall, and you were asked, among other questions, the influences on your book, and you said 10 volumes of a woman's diaries that took me longer to read than writing the novel. Another woman's letters to her sister in Boston from the gold mines in California's Central Valley. A memoir by a woman loved and admired by many writers known in her day, but unread now. A visit to Great Village to see Elizabeth Bishop's old house in Nova Scotia. Conversations with my friends, a few unshed and unsheddable tears. But I'm sorry, I just had to ask you about the 10 volumes and the letters and the memoir and just I'm sorry everybody. We will get questions, but I just
who are they?
Yes. And how did they come into your life?
The 10 volumes of the I wish I'd prepared for this. It's a one woman in Bloomsbury Circle, but it's not one of the key women. It's one of this woman who, somehow she was
not Morel.
No, not even that famous, not that well known. She was really just a diarist, and she started. I think she was married to someone who was more central in the Bloomsbury Square. Okay, Clara, I can find that woman's name.
Okay, but how fascinating. What about the 10 volumes?
10 volumes. I mean, interesting that she started to keep the journal when she was right at the end of World War II. She started to keep the journal. So I read the first volume just to get a sense of the time. I'm always interested in post-World War, like World War II, the post-war years. It's just my fascination. So I was reading her diary just to get a sense of, England after the war. And all of a sudden, it's just when you read someone's diary, you get sucked into her little personal narrative. And in fact, this woman had a tremendous, interesting life. For instance, her son, at the beginning of the 10 volume, was a very young, happy schoolboy. And later, he actually died of heart attack when he was 27. A month after his own baby was born. I think he might married one of the Vanessa Bell's people.
Kids. Yeah.
Kids.
Okay.
I think he married Vanessa Bell's daughter. But when you read 10 volumes, you realize you're reading a person's life, several generations' life. And even just in a minor scale, I think there were at least two volumes was about this one friend who's unhappy marriage. So this woman married to a husband. The husband was in love with a Polish woman, and the husband was trying to get a Polish woman to England. And it's a sort of life unfolded at real time. So I don't think she's a great writer, but she's a great entertainer. Not only, I should take it back. It's not only entertaining, it is illuminating just to know how people live.
It's interesting, actually, because one of the questions here, that question of address. So a diary is a very different thing from a letter, because a letter is, and if we think of in Must I Go, Roland wrote a diary, but then he wanted the diary published. And then, as I was saying before, then Lilia's annotating the diary, but these questions of the degree of address. So somebody, one of the audience members would like to ask, could you please elaborate on how aware you are about your audience as you write? When you write about Chinese settings and inherently Chinese characters, do you ever worry English-speaking audiences may not receive the characters as you imagine them?
Mm-hmm. I don't imagine my audience, which is interesting going back to the letters. Letters always have an audience. Very rarely diaries have audience, but the first line of Must I Go, it says, posterity, take notice. That is a line that I sort of adapted from a entry, not an entry, but Catherine Mansfield in her diary, writing about her own life. All of a sudden she would stop and say, to whoever is reading my diary at this moment, I hate you, or that kind of direct address to an audience, which means even before she died, she was very aware that her diaries were going to be published in this form. And I mean, coming back, I don't think about my audience. If I think about my audience, I probably would never be able to write another word. It is really just my relationship with my characters, and once it's finished, it's their turn to go out to meet the audience. It's
Yes, yes. I mean, it's interesting because I think different writers, I'm like you, I don't think about an audience, but I think different writers have very different responses. And some people are writing very directly to a person or a group of people, or, they have in mind something, if not, sometimes quite specific, sometimes more general, but then, it's also possible not to think about it, just to think about the story and the words.
words.
Yeah. Another question. Do you feel vulnerable or therapeutic writing many of the personal sorrows in your life in your recent works? How do you deal with your writerly need for isolation and privacy and remove while still trying to live in this world?
Such a good question. I wish I had a good answer for that. There's always that struggle between living an independent private life, and as a person, I live in the world, I engage with the world. I would say that, as a writer, I try to carve some space out, solitary space for myself. And which is the first part of the question? I feel I missed the first part of the question.
It was, do you feel vulnerable?
Oh, yes.
Therapeutic? Do you feel it's vulnerable or therapeutic to write about
Right.
things that are close to you, that are personal?
Neither, I would say. I don't feel vulnerable. I mean, if I did feel vulnerable, I probably would not have written it. I think Lydia made me feel vulnerable, and then I have to battle with Lydia. I don't ever write for therapeutical reason, so I don't feel it's therapeutical. But I do want to say I learned so much. Just this one essay you just mentioned in the New Yorker this week. It is about my father's death and my son's death. And while I was doing the editing with, the New Yorker, they did multiple rounds. And when we were doing this editing, the editor said something so fascinating and wonderful to me. And she said, sometimes I feel when we edit the piece, it's like a medical procedure. We put the contents of the story or the essay into anesthesia, under anesthesia. And we're really just, we're talking about words and commas and punctuation instead of the contents. And it is truly, sometimes I don't think it's therapeutical, but I think just in the process of trying to get the words right, that almost is like putting something on hold and let me figure out how to say this thing before I go back and feel those pains. So
That makes a lot of sense. Thank
Yeah.
you. Okay. I think we have time for just a couple more. In 2016, you published The Story of Gilgamesh, rewriting the epic in the voice of children's literature. What's the difference between rewriting a canonical story and creating a story from nowhere? Is it harder to write stories for children because in some sense they have a closer relationship with what the language refers to rather than the trick of the language itself?
It's a great question. So it is a project, commissioned by an Italian laboratory school, and they asked 10 writers from around the world to rewrite 10 classics for children. And their only requirement has to be under 10,000 words, so a parent can read aloud within an hour to the children. So I chose Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh, I mean, we can talk about Gilgamesh for another 10 hours. It's just how you write for children, especially younger children. And remember in Gilgamesh, King Kudu. I mean, the brother, when he first came, he was like an animal. He was running with the bees, and then they sent a woman to seduce him, and then they had sex, and all of a sudden he could not run again. He could not run fast. It was very lovely, but for children, I I think I didn't even change to kiss. It's just something awakened in this person. When he looked at the woman, he realized he is a person. So I think for children, it's just to make them understand what's going on without complicating the details. I think it's really the choice of details, just not using too complicated details. Yes, I think I do think there's one thing about rewriting classics or canonical literature. I think there still should be a sort of a frame or hook, and I think eventually in my retelling, Gilgamesh was a storyteller. He lived through this, and he came back to tell the story of his lost brother, his lost, his pain, his sorrow, and his triumph. So I think that's sort of just the frame that I came up for Gilgamesh.
But it's also a way to make the story yours in a way.
Yes, yes.
Right.
I had a lot of fun writing that story.
Yeah. So just quickly, is it intrinsically different to start from nothing?
Yes, I actually I would say it's easier to start with nothing.
It's like house renovation. They always say, no, for the builders, it's easier to build a new house than to renovate the
Yes,
existing house.
yes, yes.
Yeah. So one last question. I'm also not me, the questioner. I'm also a Chinese-born artist who found an identity as an artist in a world I navigate using the English language. Most of the artists I feel affinity with also express themselves with English in a Western-centric global art world. And in this case, the borderline is not only language, but also cultural. While I feel a creative and personal freedom I don't feel when speaking Chinese, there's an aching in me that I perhaps purposely let go of my ability to form deep connections with artists who speak Chinese and the contemporary Chinese culture. Do you happen to have a community of Chinese speaking artists, or do you feel a distance from them?
Well, I just happen not to have a community. I guess when I write, I'm never in any community. I'm in my little cocoon. So I don't think I have a community of Chinese speaking artists or writers, but there's one Chinese artist, a pianist. I like her so much. I've never met her. She had a very interesting story. So she grew up in Cultural Revolution. She was sent down to the countryside, and she really wanted to become a concert pianist. She had her mother ship the piano to the countryside. Wow. She never stopped playing the piano when she was a peasant. And then she came to America, fascinating story. So when she came to America, she became sort of a maid. Actually, she lived in Boston for a few years. I think she was actually working as a maid in one of the musicians working for Boston Symphony. And when the musician was out, she would play on the piano. And eventually she moved to Paris. She lived in Paris, and she became this world famous concert pianist. But she never wanted to play in China. China has invited her many times, and she didn't want to play. Eventually, she agreed to give one concert in Hong Kong, and she went to see the concert hall. And then she said, can we not sell the tickets? I'll just play to these few seats. You can sell a few tickets. I'll just play for these few seats, and we can just cordon off every other seat. I just thought, as a pianist, she plays Bach. I think she's known for playing Bach, but even as a pianist, she has some sort of distance to that culture. And it's not saying anything about her or about Chinese culture. It's just a personal choice. And so I like her. I always imagine, I'm writing to an empty auditorium with a few seats, a few people there, and that's good enough.
Oh, that's lovely. That's maybe a good place to end. Picture you writing in the auditorium to this. We are all privileged to have been the small audience this evening. I cannot thank you enough, Yiyun Li, and everybody. I hope you've taken a moment to order Yiyun's new books, but if you haven't read them, her earlier books, from the link in the chat. And I also want to remind everybody of the event on December 9th at 4 p.m. with Teju Cole and Alice Oswald. And I want to say, Yiyun, thank you so much. We look forward to what you'll write next. And I hope for the chance for you to come and visit us in person when these dark days are behind us. So
we must keep that hope. Thank you so much, Claire.
thank you so much. Good night,
Thank you.
everybody.